Nature isn't just out there in some far-off exotic location. It's all around us, including right outside our doors. Hi, my name is Shannon Trimboli, and I am the host of Backyard Ecology. I invite you to join us as we ignite our curiosity and natural wonder, explore our yards and communities, and improve our local pollinator and wildlife habitat. Hi, everyone. Today we are talking with Becca Rodomsky-Bish, who is the project leader for the Great Backyard Bird Count. Hi, Becca. Welcome to Backyard Ecology. Thanks for talking with us today.
Hi, Shannon. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So let's start out by telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure. I work at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology in Ithaca, New York, and I am the project leader for the Great Backyard Bird Count, as you shared at the beginning. I also lead another project at the lab called NestQuest Go. Both of these projects deal with bird issues. I am my background is biology, ecology, human systems, and the area within the lab that I work on deals specifically with something called citizen science, which is this idea that everyday people can participate in the scientific process if they're interested. And the projects I work on specifically focus around birds.
Yeah, we've talked quite a bit already, even though Backyard Ecology is still pretty new as a podcast. We've talked quite a bit about citizen science, community science. It's a field that I've worked in quite a bit too in my previous job, and something that's really near and dear to my heart and I love doing too. But yeah, so that's really the reason why I asked you to be on here today, is because the Great Backyard Bird Count is something that is really coming up very quickly on February 12th and 15th. And I know many of our listeners are really interested in attracting birds to their yards, watching birds. And I think this is something that many of them might be very interested in learning about and potentially participating in. So can you tell us a little bit about Great Backyard Bird Count?
Sure. Yeah, it's wonderful. Those features that you described, your listeners, I fall into that category. I'm an avid gardener and a bird watcher myself. And a lot of people sort of shy away from saying that they're birders. And I'm kind of one of them too, though I am a birder because I watch them every day and do a lot of active things at home to attract them. So when I say that term, I really mean anybody who loves and appreciates birds, even if you don't know, every single one that you see outside your window.
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean by it too. I mean, everybody that watches birds is a birder to me.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, that's great. So this audience would probably love the Great Backyard Bird Count. It's 4 days long. So this particular year, the dates actually fluctuate every year, but this year it's the 12th through the 15th. And it's as simple as spending one 15-minute chunk on any of those 4 days looking at birds, figuring out what birds you're looking at if you don't know, and then entering that bird or those birds, even if it's just one or many, into our database so it can be compiled, and we can have a global list of birds that are seen and documented on this particular weekend in February. And it's really fun. You can do this right outside your window. And this year, that's how a lot of people will be participating. It's a great way for us when we're at home and hunkered down to be able to contribute and participate in something that's really a global movement and a global activity.
Is it just restricted to what you see out your window, or can you do it anywhere?
Absolutely anywhere. And we love when people travel in and around their communities. Some people actually, spend this time, maybe not this year, but in the past, spend this weekend traveling to places that they want to go to, so they can see new birds to add to the GBBC and their bird count lists. So it can be done literally outside your window, your local park, your school, your neighborhood block, your nature preserve, your local park, anywhere there's birds, which is pretty much anywhere. In downtown, in a city, if you live in an urban area, all of those birds count, and we want to know about all of them.
That's great. And I like the fact that it is looking at everywhere. I mean, from the backyards to the front yards to the city and county parks, all the way up to national parks and state parks, and that it is global, because that's just so cool to think that people all over the world are doing the same thing.
Absolutely. We have a really fun map on our website where people can see lists coming in, or people's bird counts from around the world. And it's one of my favorite things. I have an almost 5-year-old, and we'll sit down at the computer and we'll enter in our birds, and we'll have a window next to us that has the submission map, and I'll submit, and a little lights up right in the area in Ithaca, New York. So it's really fun. You can literally watch the world light up with all of the submissions that are happening that weekend.
Oh, that is just so cool.
Yeah.
And you mentioned your almost 5-year-old. Does that mean that anybody can do? I mean, no ages?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yes, all ages can do this. All of the data is entered into the eBird tool. And if your listeners are bird watchers, they may be familiar with eBird already. You have to be at least 13 to officially have your own account. But what we encourage teachers or parents who have children that want to contribute, have an adult actually create the account and just make sure that you use a username and password that you're comfortable sharing with your classroom or your children, and then they can participate as well too. So the actual account needs to be with somebody at least 13 or over, but any age group is welcome to participate and submit data. We love when families and classrooms submit data.
Oh, cool. But for some of our listeners who may not be familiar with eBird, can you explain a little bit about it?
Sure, absolutely. So eBird is a tool that has been around since a little bit more history. GBBC was a little bit of a testing ground to see if people would even submit bird lists online. So that's what's kind of neat. GBBC predates eBird, and they found that people loved this, and it just sort of grew every year. And so in the early 2000s, they started to plan for the launch of eBird. And I think the official launch happened in about 2003 or so. And then each year it's just grown. It's become more sophisticated and more advanced. But the sort of nugget of eBird is that it's a global database for bird observations from everywhere, literally everywhere, any place around the world. If you see a bird, you can enter it into eBird, and it goes into a very large database, as you can imagine. And then scientists are able to request that data. Sometimes it's data from a very small, isolated place in the world, and sometimes it's all of the data that has been collected over a period of time. And then scientists analyze that data from eBird to understand what is happening with bird populations in different parts of the world at different times. So it's a citizen science tool that has actually been used in more than 100 publications. So scientists are actually using this data very actively because, as many of your listeners probably know, we're in the middle of sort of a biodiversity crisis, so to speak. We know that biodiversity is declining, and we're trying to understand why and where, and most importantly, what we can do about it.
And eBird, for the bird watcher, for anybody that's adding data in there and stuff, it can serve as basically a life list almost as well for them. Instead of writing it all on paper like many of us used to do, you can now just enter it in to eBird and be able to pull it up whenever you want to as well.
That's right. We'll store that data for you. And all you need to do is go online and enter your username and password, and you can see all of the birds in all of the places that you've identified them. And one of the tools I thought your listeners might be really interested in, that's sort of a new feature this year. There's a bird app for those of you that have smartphones that you can download called Merlin. And this is, again, an international tool. It's available, I believe, in 8 languages, actually, and all of the continents. And so for people that really love birds but don't actually know all of the species, and they would like to know that information in order to contribute to a list like eBird, they can ID a bird by answering 5 questions. And then based on your region, it will spit out to you the possible answers. And then you can choose your answer. And then new this year, you can actually immediately drop that answer right into eBird. It's very seamless on your phone app. So that's a new feature. And that's kind of a good feature for people who consider themselves newer to birding and really want to make sure that they're entering data that's really accurate.
I can see that being a really cool app and feature and tool for even people who are more familiar with birds, but maybe in an area that they aren't as familiar with.
Right.
So when you're traveling or going to a new area like that, and you're finding birds that you may not have been exposed to before. I mean, nobody knows everything for all places, especially.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a really wonderful tool. I actually, when I was putting together the website, there were some pictures that had come in from India and Central America, and I had no idea what these birds were because I've never birded in those places. So I used Merlin in order to figure out just from a picture what birds I was looking at. So it's a great tool for birding in places you're unfamiliar.
Mm-hmm. And then also, like you said, for starting to learn.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like that. It can be used at all levels.
Exactly.
So with the Great Backyard Bird Count, because we're talking about multiple different things, which is important because eBird is a major tool and component of the Great Backyard Bird Count.
Correct.
So let's walk through this. We go out, we look out our window, go in our yard, go for a walk at the local park, whatever, spend 15 minutes. Well, let me back up there. If I'm going for a hike, can I do eBird as I hike? Say it's an hour-long hike, or does it have to be in a spot?
Great question. It does not need to be in a spot. When you enter your data into eBird, you can enter it as a stationary count or a traveling count. And if you're going to do a traveling count, it'll ask you to actually map the distance and the locations that you started and ended on. So you can enter either.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Okay, so I've gotten to my location, whether that is, like I said, backyard, on the trail, wherever. Spend at least 15 minutes
Yep.
watching the birds.
Correct.
Do I have to count the birds, or am I just identifying what's there?
So you want to count the total amount of birds that you see within that time period you're watching. So if you are going to watch for just 15 minutes, for example, and you're sitting and watching maybe outside your window, and you look down and you see maybe a blue jay, and then it flies away, and then another blue jay flies in. It may or may not be the same bird, so it can be a little bit tricky. So we ask people that are doing that kind of observation to just give their best estimate in that 15-minute period window. So you might see a blue jay fly in and out 5 times, and you may know that it's the same blue jay because you're watching it, and then you would just put one blue jay. But if you really are seeing multiple bird species flying in and out, you would just want to provide an estimate across that period of 15 minutes of how many of the specific species that you saw.
And then can I do it for longer than 15 minutes?
Absolutely. So we say a minimum of 15, but you may sit and watch for an hour. And so when you enter your data into eBird, you're going to provide your start and your end time. So you're going to tell us in that specific location or on that specific trail route when you started and when you ended, and then that will get logged with that particular list. So you may do a count, like I often do a count in the morning when I get up, and then I'll do another one maybe at lunch, and sometimes another one at dusk. Those would be 3 different counts taken at different times of the day, and however much time I spend counting, I just want to record that when I enter the data.
So we've gotten our count, and we can do this all 4 days if we want to, multiple times, however often we want, correct?
Correct.
And then we go to eBird and then upload our information?
Yep. So you can either get to the portal with which you're going to enter this information from our website, which is birdcount.org, or you can go right into eBird, or you can go into Merlin. So there's kind of 3 main ways that you can enter data. And on our website, on our participate page, we actually lay this out. We ask people to think about what's the easiest way for them to enter data. Some of your listeners may not use phones, so using just your desktop, whether it's through our website or directly eBird, the data counts, your entries count. If your listeners have phones, they can download Merlin ahead of time, and eBird itself actually has a really easy to use phone app. They can download ahead of time and enter their data there. So basically, any data that is entered in eBird, in Merlin, or from our site over those 4 days, all of that counts towards the Great Backyard Bird Count data.
That's nice, yeah. Because I've got a smartphone and everything, but I tend to use it more as a phone. My primary computing device is my computer, right? So data entry and stuff, I like the bigger screen and the bigger keys.
Yeah. You're not alone there. I prefer to use my computer for data entry too.
Yeah.
So absolutely.
But yeah, then I know lots of people who the phone is what they use. So I like the fact it works either way.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. How's the data used? So we're entering all this data, and then what happens?
Yeah, great point. Well, as many of your listeners who are in the world of science probably know, scientific analysis takes a lot of time.
Oh, yeah.
So I provided you actually with a link you're welcome to share if you would like on your page that shows actually all the publications that eBird data has been used in. And again, like I said, all the data from GBBC Weekend gets lumped into eBird data, and depending on who is requesting the data, that's sort of pulled out on a per diem basis based on what the researcher is looking at. But a hypothetical walkthrough. Let's say somebody wants to do a publication in Science, and they're looking at changes in blue jay populations over time in the state of New York. They would perhaps reach out to eBird, ask for that specific data for X amount of years that they're looking at. They'd get that data, and they'd probably spend, if they asked for that data today, they'd probably spend almost probably a full year analyzing that data, trying to figure out, find patterns, asking peers to review their analysis, et cetera, et cetera. And then probably after a year or so, they might have a rough draft, and then they might submit to Science, and Science will likely say, you need to make some changes here, there, and so forth. So when I say, you know, people that submit data in 2021 count, your data will appear. It might take a couple of years just because of how analysis works in the field of science. But if you submit for a particular species, wherever you are living, that data will 100% guarantee find itself in the hands of probably many, many, many researchers who are asking various questions about bird populations.
Yeah. That's nice that it can be used for so many different purposes throughout, really depending on what people are looking at and what they're needing on the research as well.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's one of the reasons why, you know, birds are, you know, we kind of say that they can be a really powerful conservation tool, because where birds are present and where they're not present, what species are present, what species aren't present, that really tells us a lot actually about the ecology of a particular region. So when we talk about bird lists, it's really safe to say that those bird lists can be used to understand even bigger ecological questions within the area that we're taking notes on those birds.
Yeah. And you kind of touched on this, but knowing what's in any one place at any one time is really important to science, both now, because you're not going to find deep forest birds in the middle of a grassland.
Right.
Or wetland birds in the middle of a desert. You can look at what the birds that you're finding are and kind of make those assumptions as to what the habitat's like. And then you look at how things might change in the future or how things have changed from previous lists.
Absolutely.
So yeah, this data is important. Even something as simple as making a list and having that available.
Absolutely. You know, some people will ask us, well, I didn't get any cardinals in my count this year. And, you know, is that okay? Well, that's actually really okay, because as you just articulated, the absence of species is important. So it's important data. If we have somebody's data that for, 10 years consecutively, they always have northern cardinals, and then all of a sudden they stop, and there's none of those, that tells us something happened, right? And then scientists can begin to investigate what that something could be.
Yeah, and that's why projects like this are also so important in my mind, is because there's only so many scientists and they can only be so many places at one time. Like any one person can be one place.
Yes.
So if you've got everybody out there doing a little bit of looking, you've got more eyes on the ground, you notice things faster. Like, all my cardinals disappeared this year.
Right.
That's something that might not be noticed or recognized if there wasn't a scientist right next door to you doing the same thing. And not just any old scientist, a scientist that's looking at birds, because not all scientists look at the same thing.
Yes, exactly. You hit the nail on the head there. I can tell you've been active in citizen science, because that's sort of what we say all the time. Scientists can't be everywhere all the time, but there are people everywhere all the time. So if we can all be scientists, then we can actually ask and answer more questions.
And sometimes it's just having that data, knowing what was there. I mean,
Right.
Even if there isn't we're going to use this for this purpose today, but having that information so that it can be used in the future.
Right.
To look at things for questions that we don't even know to ask yet.
Exactly. Yep. And as you articulated, that's why longitudinal data is so important. So data over time. eBird has existed for quite a while, but there's other projects like the Christmas bird count. Mm-hmm. And that is the power of all this data. Some people get very confused. Well, what is this one? What is this project? They're all important. All of that data is going to be used by scientists for different reasons. And the projects that have been going the longest do have this valuable component where we have years and years and years of data, so we can look at changes over time with a little more clarity than we can some of the newer projects.
Right. And like with the Christmas bird count, that's been going on for over 100 years now.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, I mean, you can imagine just how things have changed and how different it is now from what it started out as being.
Absolutely. The Christmas bird count data was actually pretty important data in the 3 billion birds research that came out last year, where we were able to, the lab, one of my colleagues was the main author on that piece, where we were able to actually say we have lost almost a third of our birds in North America. We have lost 3 billion birds since 1970. And without that Christmas bird count data, we wouldn't have had that sort of length of information to be able to analyze that.
And then with the Great Backyard Bird Count, I mean, it's much more recent, obviously. It's online. Didn't have the internet 100 years ago. But I mean, it's also happening at a slightly different time of the year. So
Absolutely.
you can look and see, I'm assuming you could probably do comparisons to see if things have changed just with the timing of when you see things.
Absolutely. Yep. And, with GBBC, or we call it GBBC sometimes for short, but the Great Backyard Bird Count, with it being in February and being global, it's actually a really lovely snapshot of time right before big migration moves. So a lot of people ask, why is this in February? It is cold where I live. There is, 7 feet of snow on the ground. Why am I counting birds? And that's a really good question. And the short answer is because we want to know where birds are before they start to take off on that big migration that they start to make. Usually some birds start as early as late February, early March to make that move to their breeding grounds.
And it probably also depends on where you're at. I mean,
yes, February
in Florida is going to be a lot different than February in Alaska.
Absolutely. I'm always jealous of the lists that come in Colombia. That's where we have sort of the largest diversity of birds. And it's just incredible, in the middle of February, the species that people are seeing. So you're 100% correct. When you put it on that global scale, that's what's really powerful, is there's actually a ton of bird activity going on all the time. It just depends on where you are.
And even during the winter, there's a ton of birds out there. They're just different birds sometimes and not as flashy, and we have to bundle up a little bit more to go out and find them.
That's right. A couple of my favorite Great Backyard Bird Count participants say, if it wasn't for this count, I probably wouldn't go outside at all in February. It gives me an excuse to get out my door and go see what I can see.
Yeah, and if you don't want to go out, it's the backyard bird count. Do it from your window.
That's right. Cup of tea in hand, all is well.
So what's your feel for participation as far as how many people are doing it from, or what's not number of people, but kind of the percentage? Are there a lot doing it from the yards and from the windows, or more getting out and going to see? What's some of the stories?
That's a good question. I don't have, solid statistics that I can lean into. But last year we had about almost 270,000 estimated participants from around the world. Wow. Yeah, which is really exciting. And about somewhere between probably 100 to 160,000 of those are specifically in North America. So that would include, Canada as well as the United States. So, there's a lot of participation here. There's growing participation in other countries. I would say in the United States and Canada, a good portion, at least half of people are probably doing the bird count right there on their properties. And that's because, projects like Project Feeder Watch, which your listeners might be familiar with, is another project at the lab that's very focused on people's backyard feeders. So a lot of people are already that are counting birds are already in the zone, so to speak, of looking right out their windows to do the counts. So I would say a good half of our participants are those people. And then I would say there's a good half or more of people who are regular walkers in and around their communities or their park. This count weekend is an opportunity to do counting in the places that they love to spend time walking and exploring. And then in other countries, it runs the gamut as well. I would say backyard bird watching is a little less common in some countries, but they're lucky enough to have birds that, we would normally have to go to a big park to see in and around their homes. So in other countries, I would say there might be a little bit more emphasis on, going out to your local parks to see and watch birds rather than right there in and around your homes. But again, it really depends on the region that the person's living in and what they see In North America in particular, I would say it's almost probably a 50-50 split.
And that makes sense too. I love the idea of being able to really get out and pay attention to what's in our yards and what's in our communities. In my own career, I've realized that, yeah, I fell victim to the same thing everybody else does, thinking all the really cool, awesome stuff is somewhere else. And
Yeah.
there are lots of really cool, awesome stuff somewhere else as well. But we sometimes forget all the cool, awesome stuff in our own yards, and we forget to look at it. And so just like we think all the cool stuff is in somebody else's yard, they think all the cool stuff's over here where we're at.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And there are incredible bird sightings in cities. I mean, New York City has some of the most amazing bird entries and lists that come in. And
Really?
people would think, oh my gosh, the middle. No, where there is any kind of greenery or life beyond, just buildings, you're going to find birds. They will come. They will, because they're moving, right? They're moving all the time, even if they're not full migrants. They're still moving in and around spaces to be able to find food and resources, shelter, water. So yeah, you would be surprised the kinds of birds that we see in cities. 100%.
Can you give us some examples?
Sure. I have a good dear friend and colleague who lives in Syracuse, actually, in an apartment in Syracuse. And she has bird feeders and water set up right on her deck, her balcony. She gets hairy woodpeckers, downy woodpeckers, I know, it's incredible. She has almost as much diversity at her feeders as I do at mine. And I live in a rural upstate area where you would sort of expect to see those species. So absolutely, if you provide habitat for wildlife and birds in particular, they will find it. They will come.
Yeah, I mean, Harry's are not one that I would have expected to be in the city.
Mm-hmm. I know. I mean, she happens to live in an apartment that's in the city that happens to have, a couple parks down the way and a cemetery. So, she doesn't live in a place completely devoid of green spaces, but she only has an apartment, and I think she's on the second or the third floor, and she's still able to attract that kind of diversity.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Any other stories that you can share with us of things that you've seen or reports that you've had?
I get a lot of feedback from teachers, educators, that this counting activity, and this may perhaps be true even more so this year, where a lot of educators are trying to provide virtual and remote options for their children and students to continue to keep learning, or parents that are homeschooling this year because of caution and concern about COVID. But some of the best stories I get are these stories where teachers will say, I had this student and he or she was a sweet student, but really just had a hard time engaging in the lessons. And then we did a lesson on building a bird feeder so we could set it up to count birds for this weekend count. And this child is hooked. One particular teacher said that my student got off the bus at home on this count weekend after he had set up his bird feeder. He turned around, walked all the way back to school because he wanted to sit and spend the rest of the afternoon watching his bird feeder so he could count for the weekend.
Oh, wow.
And just, stories like that are so sweet. So birds are they're a charismatic organism, and people, especially if people haven't really stopped to spend time to look at the birds, once they do, they're often hooked. And like you say, very surprised at the different species right there in and around their community that are there, but they just had never stopped to pay attention.
Well, for that person that hasn't really stopped to pay attention, is really just thinking, oh, this sounds kind of cool. Maybe I'll give it a shot.
Yeah.
What would be your suggestion for just getting started? Somebody who's like, oh, I can tell cardinal, but that's it.
Well, hey, if they can tell a northern cardinal, they're already in.
Mm-hmm.
I guess my advice would be pick a place that you really like, and literally that might be out your window, and that is 100% wonderful. But pick a place that you enjoy being, and if you wanted to prepare sort of ahead of time, spend 15 minutes every day just sitting at that place and seeing what you see, stepping out onto your porch or your balcony or on your walk. And you don't even need binoculars. Binoculars are a great tool. It really helps you to see more details of birds. So if you have a pair of binoculars, bring them. But you may not. You may just be using your own eyes to observe what you're observing. And just try to start to make a mental note. What are you seeing? What size are the birds? That's a really important one, especially if you want to start to be able to identify more. What size are they? What color are they? What kind of beak shape do they have? Depending on what the birds eat, they'll have different shaped beaks. And a bird that a lot of people are really familiar with that I kind of encourage people to have as their benchmark is like a crow. So most of us have seen crows no matter where we live, or pigeons. So is it bigger than a crow or a pigeon? Is it smaller? Most of our songbirds are going to be smaller. And so, trying to just start to pay attention, just start to watch. And I am not a wonderful birder by ear. I know some birds, but I don't know a ton. But listening.
That's where I'm at.
Yeah, listening is another thing. If you're really into music and sound, paying attention to that music and sound, and you can start to ID birds through sound as well.
And yeah, I like the fact that you brought up by size based on something that you're more familiar with, like a crow or a pigeon or something like that. Because when we talk about size, we're not talking about, is it 3 inches or 4 inches?
Right.
Yes, the field guides have that in there, but I don't know any bird that's going to sit there long enough for me to run up with a ruler and go, okay, how long?
Right.
Yeah, it's always based on, okay, is it bigger than this bird? I use sparrows a lot of times, or robins is what I'm looking at.
Yeah, sparrows and robins. Yeah. And actually, I think that might be the birds. I think the order might be sparrow, robin, maybe crow or blackbird. But in Merlin, that's how you will ID size, actually, is they're going to ask you to compare the bird that you saw to other more familiar individual birds or groups of birds. So that is a great way to start to think about and catalog bird identification.
Yeah. And with Merlin, that's going to help out a whole lot, because you don't have to, it doesn't sound like you have to necessarily know, okay, that looks like a sparrow. You can say, okay, it's about that size.
Right.
And it's brown and white stripedy, which to me automatically says sparrow, but then I've got a little bit more experience with birds. And for somebody that's just starting out, they may not know that, okay, brown stripedy birds in the winter in the Southeast especially, think sparrows.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's actually not going to ask you any of that species information. It'll ask you, well, it actually won't ask you if you're using it on your phone. It'll know what your location is. That's pre-programmed into your phone. It'll ask you the date on which you saw it. So obviously this February weekend. It'll ask you this size range. It'll ask you colors. And then the last important question it'll ask is, where did you see the bird? So did you see it at your feeder? Did you see it next to the water at your local pond? Did you see it on a fence post next to a field? It'll ask you where you actually saw the bird, and then it will give you a bunch of answers or possible answers. And I will say that I actually just started using Merlin consistently in the last couple of years. It's been around a while, but I personally have just started using it. And I am amazed at how accurate it is. Usually I'll get 5 to 6 possible answers, and almost, I would say 90% of the time, one of the answers is actually the bird that I'm looking at, which is amazing. Yeah, Merlin is kind of a, it's getting better with every ID that people do and save, because it's able to hone in better and better at what actually people are seeing when they record. Yes, that is absolutely my bird. That data filters back into Merlin, and it just becomes that more advanced at producing correct answers.
Yeah, I can imagine how much that would be helpful for either learning birds to start with, or learning birds that you don't know, whether that's just because it's a new bird to you in your local area, because there's birds I'm still learning in my area, or if it's somewhere else that you're just visiting on vacation or something, because there's so much, birds don't always sit still long enough for you to get a good look at what shape their beak is or what color their beak is.
It's very true. They are quick.
Yes. And then you have to know what to compare it to, which, for people that have been watching birds forever, okay, we've pretty much got that down. We know that's just, you got to look at it.
Yep.
And get that quick glance. But I know when I started learning, Oh, that frustrated me so much.
It's very true. It's very true. And on that note, if for some chance you are able to capture pictures, you can also use a picture feature in Merlin that will help identify your bird. If you can upload a picture from your phone, that works really well, actually.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. But you're right. They don't sit still long enough. Their metabolisms are so quick. They are always on the move.
Yes. Or there's always that leaf or twig in the way.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Indeed. Indeed.
That's another nice thing about doing it at a feeder or something right outside your window. You usually get a little bit easier views of them, closer views.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. It's true.
So is there anything else you would like to share with us or that you can think of before we wrap up?
No, I would just encourage your listeners to see themselves being able to participate no matter where they fall on the spectrum of being a birder. And like you and I articulated earlier in the show, if you like birds and if you spend even just a couple of minutes every day noticing them and paying attention to them, that you yourself could be a participant and a very valued participant in adding your data to the Great Backyard Bird Count. It really is meant to be a project that anybody at any level can engage in and participate in.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I will definitely have links to the Great Backyard Bird Count website in the show notes so that everybody can go and check it out. And it does have links to Merlin as well on that website.
It does. Yep,
okay.
It does.
And I may just throw a link to Merlin eBird up as well, just on the show notes.
Absolutely. And I'm not sure how your language in the audience pool that you reach, but the pages are available in Spanish and French as well. So we would love to offer even more languages, but we're trying to at least cater to the 2 languages that are pretty common in the United States and Canada.
Yeah, that's awesome too. And 3 is the start, and then you can always add in more languages later. You always have to start somewhere.
That's right.
Yeah. And if people have questions or get stumped, what should they do?
They are welcome to reach out to us at the great gbbc@cornell.edu, and we will absolutely get back to them and answer their questions. That's probably the easiest URL to direct people to. On our website, we also have a contact us link at the top of our page, so people can click there, fill out a very brief form, and that gets dumped right into our email. And then if your listeners are really interested in learning more about GBBC and or some of the other projects, there's a newsletter sign up that can be found either at the top of our homepage, birdcount.org, or at the bottom.
Okay, so unless you can think of anything else, thanks for talking with us today. This has been great.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shannon, for having me and allowing me to speak with your listeners. And I hope that everybody will get outside or sit by a window and participate this weekend.
Yes, and even if it happens to be raining or snowing, I'm in Kentucky, it rains more than it snows.
Yes.
But if it's raining or snowing, the birds are still going to move. I mean, they might not move as much, you might not see as many, but there's always something going on.
There is always something going on. Absolutely. And that is actually really great data to be able to see birds and their movements and their activity and their presence in different weather conditions is actually also very informative. So absolutely.
That brings up a question. Is there a weather note on it so that if it's absolutely pouring down rain or blizzard happening, that it's noted that? Because that might be why certain birds weren't seen, or you weren't seeing as many birds this year as the year before.
Right. People can add that kind of information into their comments when they actually submit their data. Now is pretty much always overlaid with weather data. And so when scientists are actually doing that analysis that's weather dependent, they can draw that data about the conditions in those different regions that they're studying. So it's pretty easy to merge. When I say easy, that, in the world of science and data, it's easy where you can merge that data without actually having it come out of eBird. But people are always welcome to write in specific notes or comments. There's a place to do that when they submit their sightings.
Okay. And there are lots and lots of databases to pull weather from for the scientific analysis. But yeah, that as we were wrapping up and talking about that, all of a sudden I was like, wait a minute.
Yeah, no, it's a good question.
Yeah, so that's good to know that that's taken into account, regardless of whether it's actually entered in or not.
Correct.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too, Shannon. It was lovely to speak with you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care.
I appreciate Becca taking time to talk with us. Since I live in a relatively rural area, I have a tendency to forget just how diverse the wildlife can be in cities, especially when there are green spaces and other habitat nearby. Becca's story about her friend and everything she is seeing from her apartment balcony was a good reminder that you don't have to live in the middle of nowhere to see really cool birds outside your window. And that diversity just goes to show how important our backyard and front yard and community habitats can be to our local ecosystems. If you've listened to any of my previous episodes, then you probably already know how important I think citizen science and community science can be. The Great Backyard Bird Count is just another example of how we can contribute, not only at a local level, but also at a broader global level. That saying, think globally and act locally, often comes to mind with international projects like this, because while we're all making our own local observations, when all those local observations are put together, then we get to see a much bigger, much more detailed picture than any single person could ever have put together on their own. I'm also really excited about some of those new tools that are available to help people learn how to identify the birds that they are seeing. I still tend to use my field guides when I'm trying to identify a bird because that's what I'm used to, that's what I'm familiar with. So I haven't used Merlin myself, but I see how it can be a very valuable tool. And I have also been told by other people that I know who have used it that it really does work pretty well. So if you're having trouble figuring out what the birds are that you're seeing and the field guides are a little intimidating, I really do suggest trying Merlin. See if that helps in figuring out what birds you are looking at. Before I wrap this up, I want to let you know that I also write a weekly Backyard Ecology blog. If you are enjoying this podcast, then you might also want to check out my blog. The easiest way to find my blog is to visit my website at www.backyardecology.net/blog. Until next week, I encourage you to take some time to enjoy the nature in your own yards and community.